Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's National Physical Activity Society webinar titled How to Craft More Motivating Messages, New Permission from the Recently Released Physical Activity Guidelines. Today's webinar is being recorded and can be found later at the NPAS website. That's physicalactivitysociety.org. Throughout the presentation today, you can submit questions to our presenter by typing in the questions pane on the control panel. Send them anytime during the presentation. We're going to collect and do an official Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And there might be times today during the presentation where our presenter asks you to type in a response in the questions box that we'll just take a look at during the presentation itself. We also have a continuing education certificate posted on our website. Physical activity in public health specialists, that's PAPHS, will earn 1 credit for today's webinar. Okay, today's presenter is Dr. Michelle Segar. Michelle is best-selling author of No Sweat, How the Simple Science of Motivation Can Bring You a Lifetime of Fitness. Now, this book came out about 3 years ago, and I read it then. And what I remember about it 3 years later is the discussion of the immediate benefits of physical activity and how it's not just something we do for long term. And I suspect Michelle's going to go into some more details about that today. So I look forward to hearing what she has to say about it. But Michelle directs the University of Michigan's Sport, Health, and Activity Research Policy Center. Michelle has translated science into sustainable behavioral change messages and programming for decades. She's one of the pioneers in the field of communication about physical activity. She's a sought-after speaker, trainer, and consultant for global organizations who want to accelerate and sustain positive change in their patients and their employees and their consumers. Michelle has a PhD in psychology focused on motivational processes, an MH in health behavior and health education, an MPH, and an MS in kinesiology. She also was the inaugural chair of the U.S. National Physical Activity Plan's Communications Committee from 2014 to 2017. And Michelle, I am going to turn over the controls to you.
Okay.
And once you accept those, you can take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you for that great introduction. Can you see is the first slide up?
Yep, you're ready.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm really honored that you chose to spend an hour with me talking about how we can design and deliver more motivating and science-based messaging. And the beautiful news is that the recently released physical activity guidelines actually not only gives us permission for new ways of messaging, but I personally believe it is going to revolutionize how that we are going to get significantly greater boosts in population physical activity because of one of the big changes that I'm going to talk about today. So I want to let you know. Okay, so I'm trying to change my slide and it's not. There we go. So as Pam said, I've been researching and working with this topic for more than 20 years. And the 2 questions that have been guiding all of my work are, why don't people prioritize and sustain physical activity and exercise? And how can we create sustainable self-care behaviors like physical activity in systematic ways using science-based messages and methods? So I've approached these 2 questions from both a high, top-down academic, my own research, studying across different fields of study to see, what do marketers say about this? What do communication experts, what have they found in their research? And in addition, I've been working directly with individuals, coaching people using a method that I developed over a few years to achieve sustainable motivation, physical activity motivation and behavior. So I want you to understand that the bias I'm bringing to this information in my presentation relates to looking at things from both an academic research perspective, but also a practitioner-based perspective. And at the end of the presentation, I welcome hearing perspectives that are different than mine. I welcome you pushing back against anything that I'm proposing, because I think that's the way we're going to come up with the best solutions. So the first strategy that I want to give you for developing more motivating messaging strategies is we have to pause before we go forward, and we need to take a look in our rearview mirror. We need to understand the context for our messaging and the meaning of physical activity of the new 2018 physical activity guidelines, which I'm going to be abbreviating as PAG. So off the bat, and I think this is one of the things you can type in that Pam is going to be able to read out, because I don't think I'm going to be able to see these questions, but what are some of the past physical activity guidelines? Amounts of minutes, intensity levels. Is that something, Pam, that people can type in and you can just read aloud?
Yes, as long as I'm not on mute, I can.
Okay.
So yes, type your answers where it says questions. This is just an opportunity to interact here and answer the question. What are some of the past specific physical activity guidelines?
They could be for different populations. We're just trying to get a sense of what are some different rules we've had about.
I see an answer of 5 times 30 minutes. I see
Okay.
a strength training 2 days a week. I see another of 150 minutes vigorous.
Great.
At 30 minutes a day for adults. And
Great.
popping this out so I can see more. 120 minutes of MVPA per week for I think that's adolescents. Yes.
So
number of answers.
Great. And that was the goal. The goal is to just get a handful of what are the different ways we've been taught, what are the guidelines we've been taught to have for physical activity. So in addition to guidelines, let's think about some of the messages and we've been promoting physical activity for in our society and our culture. Well, we've been taught that physical activities like walking lower disease risk, in this case, breast cancer by 42%. That's a specific type of message that's been out there and that our field is put out. We've also been promoting physical activity for better health, very commonly. We also promote physical activity as a way to rip your arms and not your pants, and to build a great lower body. Now, think about all the different ways and messages we've seen on physical activity. And interestingly, we've also taught people that the space for moving is inside, and we've put escalators to prevent people from moving their feet to get to those exercise spaces. So these are we have to think about this as part of the context. Now, another part of the context, of course, happens in a clinician office with physical activity, where research suggests that physical activity is almost always discussed related to nutrition and in weight loss contexts. So what we've done is we've promoted physical activity for prescribed in different ways, but primarily for health and weight related reasons. And we know that we have sold this message well, because when we conduct research on this question, we ask people why they exercise. In general, about 75%, the vast majority of the people, say that they actually exercise for health and weight related reasons. But if we're going to think about this from a communication and marketing perspective, which is the point of this webinar, we want to look at experts in marketing and communication, see what they say about messaging. And here's what Schultz says in Marketing News in 2015. He said, distribution of messages is not the endpoint for marketers. Instead, what counts is the influence that the messages have on consumers. So that really points out where we are in our field. We've done a great job distributing messages. And in fact, there's been a lot of uptake of what exercise means and why people should be doing it and for how long. But the problem is that it's also created a lot of confusion and even some negativity. So this is an ad that was used in a paper that's about to be published, led by Chan Tai, funded by the National Cancer Institute. And we showed images advertising exercise, and we wanted to get people's reactions. And the reactions were that this is a common type of image that people see, and they had a very negative reaction to it being about burning calories and needing to look a certain way. Also, there's tremendous confusion about what counts. So these data come from focus group research we did, a group of us did with low-income urban mothers trying to understand how to better brand and communicate about walking. When we asked different focus groups of women around the country, what are the recommendations? These are the different answers people gave. 32 an hour, 30 minutes every day, about an hour something. I was thinking 45 minutes, like 3 days a week, out of the week maybe. I'm going with 10 minutes. Here's more, I guess, until you sweat. I think it's gradually like whatever you feel most comfortable with. I don't think there's a particular right way you can or cannot walk. Everybody walks different, between 1 and 3 miles a day. So these quotes really exemplify how confusing the recommendations have been and what people believe they're supposed to do. And also, not surprisingly, in 2014, some research by Cunningham et al. Showed that in a national survey of about 4,200 US adults, less than 1% were knowledgeable about the moderate intensity 2008 physical activity guidelines. Let's pause here for a minute and contemplate this statistic. 2008, so we're talking 12 years after the Surgeon General's report came out, talking about the value of moderate level intensity physical activity, and less than 1% of adults were knowledgeable about this. So about the 150 minutes a week. So that suggests that the guidelines have not been getting through, which is really a problem if we're trying to use them as a lever for behavior change. In addition, this survey was with a cross-sectional study of US adults, but let's look at fitness professionals. Even among fitness professionals from 1999 to 2007, there was a decrease from 43% to 19% had knowledge of the current recommendations, so that their knowledge among fitness professionals declined by 56%. So again, this is the context of where we're coming from and where we are as we consider what we need to do to truly use the new PAG to have impact. So our influence to date has not been great, because approximately 80% of US adults and adolescents are insufficiently active, and this statistic really hasn't budged very much. So I want to propose to you that we really do have, and I don't feel like I'm blowing smoke here. I truly believe we have a game-changing opportunity to boost population level physical activity through the new guidelines that were just released. So the question is, how can these new guidelines impact population physical activity? So the second strategy in this webinar is that we need to understand and prioritize the single most important update in the plan. And if you want to read kind of the 10 top takeaways, this is a link you can go to, but that's not what we're focusing on today. What we're focusing on is what is the most important update in the PAG. And as soon as I read it, it was very clear to me that the removal of required bouts of time, meaning it had to be at least 10 minutes, that was removed. And I want to just briefly talk about this bout requirement, because I think its evolution is really important for all physical activity professionals to understand, and maybe you all do, but I want to feature a few things. In 1996, the Surgeon General came out with the first report on physical activity and health, and it was in this report that summarized the data to date, suggesting that physical activity could be moderate and it could be accumulated throughout the day. That was fantastic news. But then in 2008, there was what I considered to be a really troubling clarification in the guidelines. And that was what is referred to, and what I referred to in my book as the 10-minute rule. And the reason, one of the biggest reasons why I found this troubling was because when it was stated in the guidelines, there was no reference next to it, suggesting that there weren't specific data supporting exercise needing to be at least 10 minutes. And when I reached out to the authors of the guidelines about why this 10-minute specification was made when there was no data to reference this really important clarification, and I was told, oh, it's just that we don't have measurement methods to assess over 10 minutes, so we can only recommend above 10 minutes. Well, the challenge with that is that it came across as meaning the way it was read, the way it was interpreted is physical activity needs to be 10 minutes or it's not worth doing. From a motivation and learning perspective, I never, I found that troubling, and I decided to continue promoting what I had been doing before, which I'll share with you in a bit. So in 2018, the new PAG levels come out. It levels the playing field, the movement playing field, by removing bouts, and in essence saying we value all movement, every step is worth taking. Now, I was really gratified when I participated in a Twitter chat hosted by the Society of Behavioral Medicine a week or two ago, and hosted by the Society of Behavioral Medicine's president, Sherry Pagato. It was a Twitter chat about the guidelines focused on New Year's resolutions. And she actually started off by asking people, including the president of ACSM, Dr. Katie Schmitz, and David Conroy, who was one of the people and a leading expert in physical activity behavior and one of the people who worked on these guidelines, what do you think is the most important thing in these guidelines? And it was unanimous between these thought leaders' comments as well as the other participants on the Twitter chat. Look what Dr. Schmidt says. For my money, the big news is that bouts are gone. We want folks to move more, but we've opened up the ways to be successful. And David Conroy said, minimum bout length is gone. Every minute counts. So this is the most important takeaway from today, too. This is the most important thing, and this is what's game-changing about this physical activity guideline. So I want to go back to you, and I want to give you a moment to answer this question through the, I'll let Pam read off what people say, but how does a no bout mindset help people become more physically active? So how do you think this influences people?
So let's talk in our chat box here. It's our question box, and we've got folks saying things like, love that we now recognize there's nothing magical about 10 minutes. And some folks are saying less is more, and less of an I have failed mindset, knowing that everything counts. 10 minutes might seem really daunting when you're sedentary. It might seem like it doesn't count if you get that far. And wow, lots of folks are replying here. So removes a barrier for the very highly sedentary, and maybe walking even for 5 minutes can help. So there's lots of responses along those lines.
That's great. So and you guys are right on target. This means you can't fail. It means you don't have to think about whether it's worth doing. We'll talk more about it. So some of the no bout mindset, how does it permit people to be successful, and why does it help them be more physically active? In addition to the things you all said, it's life-centered, right? So it respects the fact that right now I might be leaving my house to go pick up my kids, but I've got an extra 5 minutes on my hands. So maybe I could walk around the block for those 5 minutes, or I could get there early. It means right now, wherever I am in my life, I can fit something in. It removes time barriers, it expands access, it cultivates the ability to be consistently moving our bodies, because there's always an extra minute or two that we can grab. Small fits more easily than large. And like someone else said, sometimes less is more. And I think actually oftentimes less is more. You can feel successful with any amount, which boosts people's competence and pride. It even reduces cognitive load. Think about this. We have a limited cognitive capacity, and the more we have to think and decide about things, the more we use up and the less we have. So if everything counts, there's no need to use our cognition to decide if it's worth doing or not. It permits increased variety, right? Because I might have steps in front of me. I might feel like dancing as I'm cleaning. It means it opens the door for so many different types of movements, and it creates a snack mentality for physical activity. Think about what a problem having a snack mentality for food has caused society. People are snacking, but in contrast, a snack mentality for physical activity is exactly what we want to create. It cultivates a game perspective. We can start thinking about movement bouts as a treasure hunt. Where can I find these treasures throughout the day? So it gives us permission to do any and all movement. And again, I might repeat myself multiple times because I'm so excited about this, but this is game changing. So what is the implication of this second strategy? Is that we want to help people understand that any amount of movement is worth doing and explain the science behind it. So going back to this image, we want people to understand that, yes, even if you're a gym rat and you love being in the gym, walking up the steps is still worth doing and gives you that much more. So now let's move on to the third strategy. And this is appreciating the strong influence of how we frame physical activity benefits. And I want to explain what I'm talking about. So in general, in society, we've been taught to value physical activity as a way to lose weight, manage weight, sculpt our bodies, and be healthy, whether it's prevent disease or manage disease. Those are the primary frames we've been taught. In essence, those become our reasons for exercising, our motives or our whys for exercise. So what this strategy is about is appreciating that the frames we use, the whys we use to talk to our end users, whether it's a individual consumer, whether it's a community, whether it's a patient, how we frame why we should move, research suggests has tremendous influence on our motivation for doing it and our ability to stick with it long term. And I have a whole nother presentation about that there's just no time to go into how important that is, but hopefully you understand from this influence. And fortunately, another thing I noticed about the new PAG was that new whys for exercise are featured in the 2018. I want to show you. In 2008, it starts off with this text. Being physically active is one of the most important steps that Americans of all ages can take to improve their health. The 2008 Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans provide science-based guidance to help Americans age 6 and older improve their health through appropriate physical activity. So that's a direct quote from the beginning. Let's look at the beginning of the 2018 guidelines. Approximately 80% of U.S. adults and adolescents are insufficiently active. Physical activity fosters normal growth and development and can make people feel, function, and sleep better. And check this out, and at the very end, reduce risk of many chronic diseases. The way I interpret this shift is that the people who designed the PAG have been keeping up on the emerging research showing that immediately the benefits from movement in feeling and functioning are what tend to motivate sustainable change and what tend to motivate consumer behavior. So that is really exciting, and you should start to think about how you can communicate that in the messaging that you're doing. So our whys matter, and in a publication that is recently being published, it was in press not too long ago, led by Emily Malley. This study showed that exercising for well-being, but not health or appearance, predicted future exercise among parents. Why am I showing you this conclusion from this recently published study, because we have to care about the whys for exercise we talk to people about. Exercising for well-being but not health predicted future exercise. That's been found in teens. It's been found in people between the ages of 65 and 90. And to really bring this idea home, I want to share with you a quote that Jane Brody, kind of the original health journalist, wrote in the New York Times about 7 years ago. Here's what she said. If you ask me why I exercise, weight control may be my first answer, followed by a desire to live long and well. When I read this, my heart started beating, because that wasn't what we had discussed in our interview, but that is what she's saying why she would exercise. But then she wrote this, but that's not what gets me out of the bed before dawn to bike to the Y. It's how these activities make me feel more energized, more productive, more engaged, and yes, happier, better able to smell the roses and cope with the inevitable frustrations of daily life. So let's look at this. There's a difference between why I've learned to exercise. If you ask me why, I'd tell you it's for my weight and for longevity. But that's not what gets me to decide day in and day out. It's how these activities make me feel and function. And that gets back to my point that we need, just like the new 2018 PAGs are emphasizing feeling and functioning up at the top, we need to do the same. And this quote really explains why we need to do that. So the implication of this is that we want to help people start to notice that moving helps them feel better and function better right now. So I want to give you an example about how some people do this. Because I talk about this stuff a lot, I get emails from people around the world talking to me about how these concepts, how they react to them, how they've actually operationalized them in their own lives. And I got an email just a couple of weeks ago from a woman who told me that the idea that she should care about how physical activity impacts her has really changed the way she thinks about it. And she sent me a picture. Her and her husband recently moved. And when they moved into the new city, they created a new way of thinking about physical activity. And she sent me a picture of it. And this is what they do. This is literally a picture that from her house. Julia's yoga in November. And what she did was write down how it made her feel. Nostalgic, friendly, calm. And then her partner Sean's running, grinding, sadness. Now, this may not be viewed as a positive, but helping people understand how they feel strong is really important to helping them understand what they're going to experience from it. Maybe he needs to feel sad. Maybe he's got some sadness that needs to be experienced so he can move past it. But she told me that this has actually transformed their feelings about movement and why it's important to fit in. So this is one way that people can operationalize the idea that we should notice and value how physical movement makes us feel now. Now, something that's important to know is that our whys, or our motives for exercising, actually determine the ways we move. Think about this. If someone's trying to lose weight through exercise, most likely they're going to choose to exercise at higher intensities because they're going to want to exploit that time as much as possible and burn as many calories. Similarly, if someone wants to feel centered and relaxed through physical activity, depending on the individual, they might decide to take a walk outside. So we need to care deeply about our whys, partly because they have their own motivational influence, but also because they lead to the ways people exercise. So the fourth strategy is we want to help people understand that being physically active can feel good while they're doing it. And I referred to this as the way. So a systematic review, I believe this was in Annals of Behavioral Medicine, showed that positive effective change during but not after moderate intensity physical activity was associated with future behavior. So I want to pause here and make sure I explain what that means. Basically, it's it's feeling better while you're moving, not after you're done moving, that is associated or predicts future behavior. And that's really important, because a lot of times people say, I feel so great afterwards, but I hate doing it. And in my work with individuals, I know there are some people, and I know many people, who can actually push through the I hate doing it to get to the other side. But in general, people are too taxed to consistently do a physical activity that feels punishing or negative. People just don't have the energy. So we want to make sure that the physical activity people do actually is positive while they move and not just afterwards. And in fact, it's also important to realize that being physically active doesn't feel good for everyone. So that may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but the reality is that I can give a recommendation like we want physical activity to feel good or be enjoyable, but the reality is it isn't going to feel good to everyone. So what can you do in those circumstances? Well, believe it or not, even if it doesn't feel good, if you give people choice about what they do, research suggests that it's going to cultivate autonomy. And autonomy, feeling ownership or self-determining your own physical activity, is among the greatest predictors of physical activity behavior. And of course, that comes out of the self-determination theory literature. But also, just feeling autonomous through physical activity can result in positive feelings during movement. So even if you don't like the physical activity per se, if it feels like you're in charge and you're deciding it, that can even generate positive effect during movement, which of course is really the holy grail and what we're after. And so the messaging implication from this is that we want to give people permission to take ownership over their physical activities. It's their choice. And to bring this home, I want to tell you a true story of a client of mine that you might recognize. I was working with a gentleman, and in general, when people work with me, when I coach individuals, they're not working with personal trainers, but this person happened to be. And at the end of our first session, this gentleman was complaining about the workout his personal trainer was making him do. And it ended with him being forced to run up a really steep hill. He hated running up the hill. He was exhausted. He was miserable, and he was complaining about it. And I said to him, well, it sounds to me like you hired this person, to punish you and that you feel victimized by it. But you're actually in charge. So if you hate to run up the hill, why are you doing it? Why don't you change your mind and walk up the hill? So that was my best advice. The next week he came to the session. He was so excited. He had such a different experience. And I, immediately started patting myself on the back. But I was wrong to do that, because do you know what he decided to do? He didn't walk up the hill. He decided that the fact that he could run up the hill was a privilege, that his body could handle, that he could actually do it. And in this realization, he started loving running up the hill. So this experience went from feeling like punishment to a privilege to a gift he could give himself. And we're not really going to go into it in this webinar, but this phenomenon, which I've witnessed and again and again and talk about, is called reward substitution. And it's where, or just reframing, and it's where we help people reframe the same thing from one concept to another. And in that reframe, it literally changes an activity. And science across fields, across behavior, shows us that the same activity can go from depleting to energizing just if the frame changes and we feel ownership. So the fifth strategy is reframing exercise and using messages that are supported by theory and science. So I was also really excited to learn about the Move Your Way messaging campaign that is accompanying the release of the new physical activity guideline. Let's look at this image. It's not of a typical skinny 30-something woman. It shows diverse people, and it also is focusing on whys, knowing how good I'll feel when I'm done. Now, I do have to say that I wish it would say knowing how good I'll feel when I'm running instead of I'm done, because of the research that we just discussed, but it's still heading in the right direction. There's lots of great examples, and I really encourage you as a professional to look at all the great videos and messages and posters they have on the Move Your Way website. Move Your Way actually supports people's autonomy, confidence, and relatedness. You know, the 3 psychological needs that self-determination theory would suggest need to be cultivated to produce autonomous and sustainable motivation. Now, I've been using a different message, and I've been using it since the 1990s, and I want to share this with you because I have found it to be among the most powerful interventions or part of the method that I've been using, and it's the expression everything counts. So I want to propose that it's counterintuitive, but promoting more flexible and smaller amounts of physical activity thinking can actually help people fit more movement into their busy lives. And this reflects what someone else earlier said, like how can the no bout help people? And when people who are not active think that less can be more, or give themselves permission to do less when they wouldn't give themselves permission to do more because they don't have time or they don't value the more enough, they're going to wind up getting a lot more activity in. But I do want to say there are personality differences, and some people need to hit the bullseye every time. They need to, you know, and my husband's one of them. He does the same amount of exercise every day. There's no room for flexibility, and that works for him. So people have to figure out what's going to work for them. But I believe on a population level, this more flexible, less can be more mindset is going to transform people's physical activity participation. So in 2000, my colleagues and I published a paper evaluating an intervention that I developed that had some of these messages that we're talking about today. So this is almost 20 years ago. So when people increase their awareness and acceptance of the idea that all physical movement counts, they became more flexible. And this is what we found in the focus groups on our program evaluation. Here's one participant. Before the class, meaning the program, I wouldn't go to the gym unless I had a good hour, because by the time you shower and do all of that stuff, after the program, I would go, even if I could only take 30 or a 15-minute walk around the track. This is how everything counts works. It gives, she wasn't going to go to the gym often for an hour, but because everything counts, she knew that only 15 minutes was worth doing. Now, that was almost 2 decades ago. I just taught students in a class in kinesiology how to deliver this method. And here's what, again, 2 decades later, one of the students anonymously said, "Exercising has always been a dirty word for me. Now I have scientific research that backs up why I should not have to run, since I do not enjoy it at all, why I should be kind to myself and not beat myself up for not going to the elliptical for an hour every day. And that helps me start to internalize the idea that everything counts, rather than just kind of knowing it. Now I set more realistic and productive short-term goals for myself. I have learned to really focus on doing what I enjoy more." So this comment from someone, actually a fitness student, believe it or not, who doesn't like exercising, almost 20 years later reflected the exact same thing based on the idea that everything counts. I'm showing this to you to suggest that this is a very powerful concept. So the messaging implications are that our frames and word choices matter a great deal, and to be very intentional in the terms you use and the words you use. And let's look at this for a minute. When you think about how you're going to communicate about physical activity to your community, to individuals, ask them which terms resonate best. So there's the word enjoyment, there's fun, there's feel good, there's pleasure. And I would propose to you that these words have really important nuances that will influence people's desire to move their bodies. In our field, we've tended to use the word enjoyment, but I think potentially that's too specific. And while I'm suggesting we pick the right word for our community in collaboration with them, a more generic word like feeling better or good might be a better umbrella term. Another question, which term is best when it comes to the actual act? Well, it depends. Do we talk about taking more steps? Do we use the word movement? In fact, exercise or physical activity, and I can't say what the results are, but I just looked at a soon to be published paper that actually evaluated the difference in people's physical activity goals based on whether exercise or physical activity was used, and the goals had important motivational implications. So these words really do matter, and it's important to be very intentional and mindful about that. Another concept that I've used a lot that I think is really potent is that I've branded movement as opportunities to move, or OTMs. And I have found that people really take to that concept. And the reason why I'm sharing this specific term with you too is because think about it. Movement, exercise, physical activity, there is, in a way, while they may have meaning, and especially exercise might have some negative meaning, opportunities to move frame movement as something you want. We want opportunities. So we want to try to communicate in ways that frame behavior as an opportunity, as a gift, as a daily treasure. So how can we promote more flexible thinking? One way you can do it, and in a study we published a year and a half ago, suggests that helping people think about exercise in a flexible way, so that if you don't do what you intended to do, this is a direct quote, it's not the end of the world. We interviewed, we did focus groups of low active women and high active women. And the high active women, there was a trend, there was a hint suggesting that the women who were highly active actually considered physical activity as a middle priority, something that they could flex when needed. A quote was, "If we have to spend long nights helping my son on a homework assignment, the workouts need to go by the wayside, and so be it. You have to give and take." So again, suggestions that being flexible and not feeling like a failure if you don't do what you hope to do, that flexibility can actually help people stay successful and continue to do it. And there's been some work out of Pedro Teixeira's lab, a researcher I really admire, where they did a review on predictors of weight loss maintenance, and having more flexible eating patterns, meaning you had to do this, you could be flexible, was associated with greater maintenance. And I think the same could be said for physical activity. So as we're starting to finish up the formal content before we get to the questions, I want to know, what is the single most important concept or message from today's webinar that you would like to try in your work? And I'm going to let Pam start to read out some of those things.
Okay, so again, you can type these in. Promoting everything counts. Just move. Every minute counts. Reframing of whys. Being flexible and just keep moving. Again, with every minute counts. Move your way. And kudos to the HHS people who are working on a snow day. I saw a couple of you on there. Reframing exercise as an opportunity. Opportunities to move. And OTM, opportunities to move, the idea of opportunity. And we actually had one comment that said that their client said, on Tuesdays, I get to go to yoga class. It's an opportunity.
Great. That's great. That's great. And again, the goal of today's webinar was to give you a variety of science-based thinking about how you can leverage the new guidelines to transform people's feelings about movement. Some other things that people have said: move your way, everything counts, it all adds up. And I want add to this conversation that let's not just use different expressions. Let's actually talk to our end users and our consumers of the messages about this change and why it really radicalizes physical movement in our society around the world. So having real conversations and talking about it, people get very excited about it because they honestly feel liberated from the prescriptions that they had previously felt that they had to follow. So I want to end the webinar with a really important insight from Alan Alda. He might seem like a strange person to start to wind down this webinar with, but Alan Alda has become a champion of communicating about science because he values science, but he thinks us scientists have been pretty bad at communicating it to the public. And here's what he said while he was giving a talk at the University of Michigan. If we're talking about one of our greatest achievements, science, why wouldn't we do it with our other great strength, communication? And I want to end by saying that the physical activity guidelines, the second guidelines just released, levels the movement playing field. And it gives people permission to count everything and joyfully seek out any and all opportunities to move. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention and open up for questions.
Okay, Michelle, thank you so much. We have some questions, and a few of them are phrased as comments that I think that we're going to ask for your response
Sure.
on. So the first comment was about lumping together health-related and weight-related reasons, and about the motivations being different for those two types of things, health-related or weight-related. But it's actually bringing up another comment or a kind of a spin-off about focusing exercise too much on weight. And I just wanted to get your comments on this, because my own feeling has always been that for those who get really discouraged, if they don't lose 10 pounds a week, they quit with exercise. And in the inverse, that I've also talked to people who were quite thin who felt like they don't have to exercise because they're already thin.
Well, this is a really important point. I'm so glad that person raised it. So when I started my research in the mid-90s on this topic, the research and work with people was clearly showing to me that exercising for weight loss was very demotivating and a negative reason. And but I had believed that exercising for health was a great motive. I thought it would have been a very intrinsic motive. What matters more than our health? So you can understand why I was shocked to have my data suggest that actually exercising for health reasons showed similarly poor motivation profiles and low-level physical activity participation to weight loss motives for exercising. And I was really kind of disturbed by that finding, but it forced me to think harder and look to the literature. And believe it or not, while health can be motivating for some, and I know some people it is motivating for, it's abstract, it's in the future, and research shows us that people are much more motivated by being immediately rewarded right now, than rewards they have to wait for in the future. And so we've been taught to value exercise for health, but until research suggests otherwise to me, I've come to believe that exercising for health is the way people have been socialized to think about it. But that it's actually not very motivating for people. And when you ask people, and I've done this a lot informally, and actually I have a video of this exact thing happening. If you ask a regular exerciser why they exercise, and they say to be healthy, and you say, well, what does health give to you? Try to get under the health reason. They'll say, oh, I have so much more energy and feel better, or I feel terrible if I don't exercise. So I believe health is actually hiding feeling good now, but we've only been socialized to think about exercise from this health perspective. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, all right. So actually, there's a couple of corollaries to that, and I think one direction I want to go was with a question that a user asked rather early that there was an echo of by someone else later, and it has to do with getting enough aerobic condition and fitness that won't be developed in these small bouts, but you are getting some benefits from these smaller physical activity time periods of, just a few minutes each. So how do you handle that in communication? Is it really a matter of the different target audiences that we're talking about, where those who aren't as active now, who are rather sedentary, might need a different message? Or, what kind of response would you say to that?
That's a great, well, so on the one hand, sure, one of the answers, and there's more than one, is that, this is a great message for the people who aren't doing anything. But I feel like the question, and I actually get asked this question almost every time I give a talk, and it really has to do with what in theory we want, or what's ideal, and what's really going to happen in reality. And when we teach someone something new, we need to do it in small steps and have them build up. And being regularly physically active is a learning process. And so I think that we need to consider that most people, that prescriptions and regulations and recommendations and guidelines just aren't, to get 120 of moderate or 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, they just aren't going to influence, and might even be harmful from a motivational perspective. So I think what we want to do, I think as a society, what we need to do, and this may sound really strange, I think we need to give everyone permission, except the people, the 20% that are successful in doing it right, or getting or achieving the deadline. I wouldn't say doing it right, but achieving the guidelines. I think we need to say, guess what, people, guess what, population, we are in physical activity kindergarten. And kindergarten is the time to finger paint. It's the time to experiment and play and explore. And I think as a culture, this is where we're at. And I think we've got to basically stop privileging the gold standard, getting the optimal dose response to physical activity, in favor of getting people to fall in love with moving their bodies.
So one questioner asked that they notice a lot of the research that you've cited focuses on women. And would you feel like the same messages and strategies presented are as effective for men? What does the research show in that regard?
That's a great question. And, the study by Malley et al. That I had up about the parents, a lot of my work has been with women, but there's other work with men, and I've done some work with men too. But there is emerging work suggesting that the immediate benefits are from a human being perspective, are going to be more motivating than future health related reasons. Now the nuance is that men and women might resonate better with different words. So for example, in a study I did with men and women, and with some colleagues, gosh, this was already 8 years ago we published it, or maybe, I don't know, around that time. We looked to see if promoting exercise for well-being, the words well-being, would be more motivating than health and weight loss. And for women, it promoted more intrinsic motivation, but for men, health, in comparison, and we did, contrast in comparison to the well-being, the health did better. But the question is well-being more of a feminine term? I don't know the answer to that. We also know men have more difficulty going and getting help for mental health issues, and there's some stigma around mental health, and well-being is kind of a mental health term. So would a term for men be, it helps me clear my head better? We need a lot more research in this area, and the exciting news is that this type of research is now being prioritized.
Oh, excellent. So I have someone who was asking about the opportunities to move, and I asked for clarification here. So it's, how do opportunities to move in the context of work relate with the opportunities to move, which are choice, considering their feelings? So in other words, if physical activity is measured in labor activities, but the feelings associated with physical activity in the context of labor are not the same as what you might have in leisure, does it make a difference there?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm just I'm just thinking of so this might have to do this is a really complex issue that has to do, I think, if I'm understanding it properly, with class and necessity. So, for example, if someone doesn't have a car and has no choice and has to either walk for transportation or walks as part of their job, whether they're nurses or mail carriers, is that what we're talking about? Labor? Is that what they're talking about?
Yes. So there's a
Okay.
follow-up. Right. Yes.
Yes.
You got
So
it.
so there's two potentially contradictory findings with that. On the one hand, the necessity by labor could make it feel obligatory and not good. However, there's research to suggest that when you tell people who move for their labor, like people who clean hotel rooms, that it actually can have positive benefits. So, oh my gosh, this walking I'm doing that felt like such a drag is actually counting as exercise. Woohoo! I'm multitasking here. I'm getting paid and I'm getting my exercise in. So, I've written about this issue, and both of those things are true. And so I think what we want to do is appreciate the fact that socioeconomic status and access and privilege are going to potentially influence how labor related movement feels. Are there strategic things we can do? I think there probably are. And we also want to understand that there are going to be differences between the feelings we have when we take ownership and are moving during leisure time. And I think the more we can help people understand these differences of experience, I think the more competent they're going to become with their own body. And we want people to feel how their bodies feel. And our previous recommendations ignored our bodies. They treated our bodies like, we're just empty vessels taking pills. But no, our bodies have experiences that actually influence the meaning physical activity has for us.
Mm. So we have time for about two more questions here. And the first one has to do with children or communicating on movement to youth. And do you know if there would be any differences in communication messaging, particularly for grade school when kids are required to do physical education? Do you see differences there in the research?
Well, I think, it's funny because when it comes to kids, the way physical activity happens organically really is supported by all the research. It should feel good, it should be fun, it should be play, which supports autonomy and infers choice and ownership and connection to other people. So I think when it comes to kids, we want to make sure that we don't rob them of the messaging that is actually indigenous to their life stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And there's been some beautiful research. I keep seeing studies that are published about teaching kids that, again, come out of the self-determination theory literature. So I think the best place that person can look is to do a literature search on self-determination theory, PE, or children's physical activity, and see what the latest research is showing.
Okay. Well, we have one more question here that I wanted to pose because I think it's about ending on an optimistic note. And the question is phrased around research that Dr. Tony Yancey, Antoinette Yancey from UCLA had done some years back, and some comments that we haven't moved the needle on public health and exercise in the last several decades. And I don't have the research in front of me to back that up, but just in question about the physical activity guidelines not really resonating with the public. I mean, it's not like they have a huge budget to promote these.
Yes.
And, so there's some limitations on that. So while we do have some new changes and while we do have some guidelines that are, scientifically based, why should we be optimistic that our ingrained sedentary behavior is going to change?
So I think that's a really important question. So thank you to the person who asked that. So number one, yes, Yancey's Tony's work has been important, but it's not the same thing as a guideline. It's not the same thing that's going to get the same level of attention. This removal of bout and the attention it's been getting in the media, and for those of you on this call, you're going to further disseminate this and get people excited about it. I believe this is I think this is going to be earth shattering. It doesn't, however, take away access issues. It's not going to solve the problem in low income communities that are unsafe to walk in. This will not impact those structural level challenges. And we still need policymakers to support active living policies. However, despite that, this removal of bout, giving people permission, counting everything, looking for opportunities to move, talking about how great you feel when you move, that addition of the why to the conversation it will help movement go viral. It's going to help a new meaning for movement go viral because that's what things do when people like them and they feel better. So rather than just talking about how many steps you got, or did you achieve your steps or not, or did you make it to the gym, let's go to the photo that I put up of the people and say, how did you feel when you walked with your 10-year-old son? How did you feel, when you chatted with your best friend on the elliptical? When we get people to notice the true immediate rewards that movement brings, that's when we're going to get people excited. So I've always been pretty pessimistic that guidelines can have a big impact, but I think in this case the message is different and it's timely. And I think with everyone getting on board and staying focused on the consistent same concept that we need people to count everything and to find opportunities to move that help them feel better right now, we will transform how people think about movement and have them want it more.
Dr. Michelle Segar, thank you for participating in our webinar today. We had great questions and great participation from everyone who attended. I'm Pam Idson with the National Physical Activity Society. We will be posting more later today on our website, and this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.